Welcome back. It's the beginning of a new trading week here on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. We are discussing last week and what is happening in as far as investor sentiment is concerned. Now, Kuwait will be joining the MSCI Emerging Markets Index at the tail end of November. We are trying to address the possible read-through when it comes to looking at Nairobi as a stock exchange. To help us demystify this potential impact and where investors could possibly park their funds, Mwathi Kilonzo, who is the head of sales at EFG Armis, is joining us to help us with this conversation. Before we took the break, we had looked at what has been happening, what is the investor sentiment when it comes to Kenya, and what does the inclusion of Kuwait from the frontier to the emerging market indices as far as the MSCI is concerned means. Possibly about $12 million could find a way into Kenya, and there are specific stocks that could benefit from this. Now we are back from the break. Mwathi, please take us through what the different weightings for Kenya and other African countries will look like once Kuwait is upgraded from the frontier into the emerging market index. Over to you, Mwathi.
Sure, thank you very much. So going back to this sort of upgrade, so we think it's going to happen between November 2020 to February 2021, and Kuwait will be removed in 4 stages. So if we look at the current weighting, we look at Africa, we have, so this is the frontier, the mainstream frontier, MSCI Frontier Index. So Morocco is the largest weighting in Africa. So that moves from 11.3% to 15.3%. Nigeria is the second highest weighting, and we had a slight discussion around Nigeria and just how much it may move by, but Nigeria is currently sitting at 8.4%, and ex-Kuwait will move to 11.4%. Kenya is 8.2% at the moment and will move to 11.1% once Kuwait leaves. I mean, the other market in there is Mauritius. Mauritius is quite small, so it moves from a 0.3 to a 0.4 weighting. So that's really not the biggest change there, or the biggest weighted market. So yeah, that's basically how we compare with our peers in Africa.
Thank you for that overview, Mwathi. For East Africa, we only have Kenya being part of this MSCI index. Are any of the other countries part of it? And if not, why is that the case?
So what tends to happen is that, this composition of this index is very much driven by a few metrics, how easy it is to sort of trade FX in that market, the liquidity and the depth of the market, and by liquidity, they have thresholds. So when you look at East Africa, Kenya is the most liquid market, and is actually the one where, it's easy to move money in and out of Kenya and Uganda and Rwanda, but Tanzania used to have some restrictions, and the markets are just not as deep. So what tends to happen is that in countries which don't qualify for being part of the main index, MSCI will construct its own country index. So there would be an MSCI Tanzania, which would have a few names in there. But markets like Tanzania are very difficult. So you've got situations where regulators do get involved in the trading of names. You've got some stocks where there are official or unofficial caps, like Vodacom floors on the price. So for example, Vodacom Tanzania, which really does sap liquidity because investors cannot freely trade those names. And this is the problem with Tanzania to a large extent. The others are just victims of being smaller, less liquid names, so Uganda, Rwanda, etc.
Okay, thank you so much for that overview. Now let's look at some of the index constituents when it comes to Kenya. So you've mentioned Safaricom, KCB, and Equity Group. Is Cooperative Bank part of this constituents, or was it there? Was it removed? What's the status of Cooperative Bank in terms of that index constitution from Kenya?
I don't have that statistic on hand, but I think that Cooperative Bank was a member of the index, but was removed. But it might be the FM 100 index. So there are a few sort of sub indices there. So Cooperative, it's basically a victim, unfortunately, of liquidity. So as Cooperative lost favor with investors, and it just started trading less and less and less. Number of shares traded, value traded. eventually these things are removed. So, with these indices, what you do find is that there are regular rebalancings and additions and deletions. So what will happen is that they will look at everything in that index and then decide whether that company uh, it should be in there or should be removed. And they will also replace it with another name if they feel so necessary, or sometimes they will not, they will delete and not add. So you find, or sometimes they will change the weightings. So it's a dynamic index. So some names do fall by the wayside, but it doesn't mean that they cannot come back.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you for that. So now when we come back to Safaricom and the banking sector, we have some two events that we are looking out for. Safaricom announces its numbers on the 9th of November, and currently we are awaiting the third quarter bank results. Please give us an overview of what your expectations are when we're looking at Safaricom, some of the key considerations, as well as the banking sector.
Sure. So if we start with Safaricom, the biggest thing that we need to really understand at Safaricom is the effect of free mobile money transfers on their numbers. So M-Pesa clearly has been a very fast-growing business for them and has become a very good business from what was a nascent division. So we need clarity around that. At the same time, if you look at the Africa payment space, there's a lot of transactions. As you may have seen last week, that Stripe bought Paystack, which is a Nigerian payments business, for $200 million. There was another Kenyan-based company, DPO, which is in the process of being bought by Network International, again, for a similar number. So, the payment space in Africa is definitely very exciting, and people are really, really keen to see what goes on there. So I think we need clarity around just how the company has suffered. Because if you remember, these measures were supposed to have expired, but were extended to the end of this year. So it's been a lot longer than investors were expecting. So that's one thing. I think we also need to start looking at some of the other dynamics in the business, where they're investing. We have a new CEO as well, so investors need to see that he has taken on the reins. We also have a new CFO as well that's in the offering as well. So there's been quite a few management changes at Safaricom. Obviously, the CEO one came from an unfortunate situation. CFOs moving in sort of Vodacom affiliated groups is very normal. So there's nothing nefarious in that. So that was expected. So, I think people just need to get a sense of, I think M-Pesa is definitely the biggest thing there. So I think in November, we should have better clarity and idea. When we look at the banks, I think there we have to really see there were some questions around the number of restructurings that were done and the moratoriums. So we need to see more clarity around that. The book is really, really important. So we need to see just how badly they've been hit and how badly their clients, whether they're able to afford repayments or not, whether they're having to restructure these loans again. So I think with the banks, it's definitely a question around loans and how good they are, how bad they've gone. And, if we look at sort of information coming out of the last week or so, you could see that private sector credit growth has been sitting around 6%. We think that's a hangover from very sort of, a lot of optimism towards the end of last year and into the beginning of this year before we sort of hit that COVID wall. So, the question is just how quickly that optimism has faded away. We saw from GDP statistics that there has been obviously growth in agriculture. There has been growth in construction as well. We're seeing that in cement dispatches as well. So the banks now just need to answer questions on just what the state of the economy is and what the state of borrowers are. However, going into 2021, we think that the banks actually do offer some prospects, and they are cheap at the moment. So the question is, and by cheap I mean they're all trading below book. These are some banks that used to trade near 2 times book not so long ago. So there is potential for a nice re-rating in the banks.
Okay, fantastic. And what about some of the other companies, some of the larger blue chips, East African breweries and British American tobacco? Is there anything that could possibly change there in terms of the sentiment and the underlying fundamentals?
For EABL, this is a name that has really turned a corner over the last few years. EABL for 10 years could actually have been accused of really not performing, but they're obviously doing well in Tanzania. So that was a key regional business that had underperformed for quite a long time. They seem to have the wind behind their sails, particularly when you compare that to their largest competitor, which is the Anheuser-Busch owned subsidiary Tanzanian Breweries. So TBL seems to be having a bit of an issue at the moment and is not growing as fast as they have historically. Whether that has come from management being distracted by the Anheuser-Busch SAB Miller transaction and all the kind of transformation that goes with a large M&A transaction. Maybe now that they're on a different footing, they now will come back fighting. So EABL has done very well in Tanzania, and they're increasing their ownership in that subsidiary as well. And now, when it comes to Kenya, obviously drinking and bars and entertainment spots had been closed. Now that alcohol can now be sold and some of these bars are reopened, it's good for the business. The question ultimately comes back to whether, and we can't have any certainty because no one really knows, whether if there is a second spike in COVID cases, you may find the government finds it necessary to control eateries and bars and that type of event. I mean, we've seen in Europe that lockdowns have come back and there are controls on bars and curfews, etc. So there is a question around just how open the economy can continue and whether the government may be forced to slow down things so people are not interacting and eating as they are at the moment. So I think that's the uncertainty around EABL. Unfortunately for them, it's uncertainty that's completely out of their hands. However, we think as a business that, from the management side of the business, it's being very well run and there's a nice turnaround in their markets. And I think EABL is a stock where if you see this thing trading at around 160 or much lower than 160, it definitely does offer some attractive entry points. You just have to be a little bit patient because there are uncertainties that are completely out of the company's control.
Okay.
Now, with respect to BAT has always been in a market where dividend payments started to become a bit scarce from the banks or uncertain. BAT continues to be a nice name for dividend payments. BAT is a company which doesn't necessarily have to grow in terms of revenue. What they've been very good at cutting costs and managing their costs and increasing their profitability in that sense. BAT is also obviously subject to regulations changing and tobacco regulations, which sometimes come quite drastically and quite quickly. So there's always a lot of regulatory uncertainty around BAT and the selling and marketing of its products. I mean, you saw recently the furore around the Lift nicotine, what are they called? Those little sort of Swedish style pouches. So this is the problem with BAT, but still, pretty well run business, no problems there. You just have to be comfortable with the regulatory environment.
Okay. All right, thank you so much for that overview. So now we have looked at Kuwait, we have looked at investor sentiment pitting Kenya against Nigeria, and you've given us an overview of some of the blue chips. We are coming to the tail end of this conversation. Perhaps you can finish us off by giving us your parting shot, especially in light of where Kenya as a market is trading. It's trading at a 9.3 times price to earnings ratio. For the next 2 quarters, because you are telling us that the inclusion of Kuwait from the frontier markets index to the emerging markets will sort of go all the way from the end of November till February 2021. What does that mean in terms of the impact of inflows into Kenya, and what's your sentiment as well as a house, as EFG Ames, what are your top picks? Back to you, Mwati.
Thank you very much. So look, I think as a house, we always believe that you really need to invest in companies where management quality is high. Because in the end, they are, particularly in this type of environment where we don't know how long we are going to be in a sort of, a scare in terms of health. So you want to invest in a business which is not very levered. So by that, it doesn't have huge amounts of debt. You want to invest in a business where management teams are nimble, management teams are professional and ethical. I think those are the most important things, because markets will dip and markets will rise. So you just need to be sure that you're in the right boat for that ride. So for us, we see value in the banks. I mean, we see that the banks are, and this is purely a trading dynamic. The banks are cheap because the market has punished them for uncertainty around asset quality. But this has been a long-running issue in Kenya in terms of, people have always suspected that the NPL ratios were higher than they were, but it never really came to fruition. So there's a question of whether now, things are really bad and whether we're going to see what's going to happen. So I think we just need to be with banks which are prudent, and banks that are making the right decisions are nimble. At the same time, I think that because of the way the liquidity threshold works, it's going to be in the banks that are liquid, that investors will come back to quickly. So I think if you see value in Equity Bank, if you see value in KCB, then those will move, and historically have always moved very quickly and usually in tandem. We like Safaricom. I think there's just a bit of uncertainty which was spoken about in this interview. Personally, I think that the penetration of digital payments into parts of lives, which were maybe debit cards and other formal types of payment, has increased. Whether that behavior changes when there is a nominal fee, whether Safaricom and the banks can increase charges back to where they were, is another question as well. So I think we just need to get a better sense of those type of things. But still, I mean, this is a very well-run business. This is a business that has shown that it can go through traumatic and normal management changes and still keep its stride. It's a business that also communicates very clearly with the market, and I think that's the same with EABL, with banks as well. When management teams communicate with the market, it's very important because they can set expectations. When a team doesn't communicate with the market, and a few companies that I could name, but I won't, then the market gets surprised and you get big swings. So I think those are the sort of the things that for the time being, just stay with the tried and tested names where you're not going to get big surprises.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all the time that we had today, Mwathi. But before I let you go, is now a good time, or are you telling investors to wait it out in terms of buy now or buy later? That's the final question from my end. Back to you.
Sure, buy now. There's value. There's value in names. There are opportunities. There are dips. Some of these banks, like Equity Bank, if it gets to 35. 36, then it's attractive. Safaricom usually trades at a range. So if you pick some up 26, if it comes back, then that's always a very good entry point. And we think that it should have some momentum to break through 30. So I think 26 definitely buy some Safaricom on weakness. Same goes for KCB.
Okay.
And EABL we spoke about, anywhere below 160.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your overview. Those were great insights from Mwathi Kilonzo. Mwathi is the head of sales and equities at EFG Ames. Mwathi is telling us it's as good a time as any to buy. So buy now. He's also given us an overview in terms of look out for great management teams, low leverage in terms of having low debt. That really stands out in terms of companies that will be able to make it through this COVID-19 season. Safaricom, Equity Bank, KCB Group, as well as EABL are certainly up there with price points that he has guided on. That's all from us here at Markets Today. My name is Bithe Mwema. It was a pleasure to host you and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, same time. Good afternoon.